The clinking of champagne glasses echoed through the living room like a chorus of polished lies. "Here's to 40 years of love, sacrifice and family," my father said, lifting his glass high. Everyone cheered. I didn't. I stood near the doorway, half hidden by the arch leading to the hallway, watching the scene like an outsider at my own family's play. What would you do if the people who raised you were the ones hiding the biggest betrayal of your life? Stay with me, because this story unfolds in ways no one saw coming. My fingers tightened around the rim of my glass, not because of nerves, but because I'd already seen what was hiding behind those smiles. I had a folder tucked deep inside my purse, a quiet, heavy weight that only I knew about. The evening had started at exactly 6 p.m. My parents' modest suburban house was dressed up for the occasion. Rented white folding chairs lined the backyard, string lights zigzagged overhead, and the living room smelled faintly of baked chicken and cinnamon candles. My mother had spent the entire afternoon bustling around, pretending everything had been paid for by savings. I knew better. My father stood at the center of the room, his voice booming like a pastor delivering a sermon. "Family is everything," he declared, grinning at the crowd. He placed his hand gently on my mother's shoulder as if they were the perfect team. People swooned, laughed, raised their glasses. My sister sat near the sofa, her husband beside her, both of them beaming like dutiful children. If you glanced quickly, you'd think it was a picture-perfect moment. But if you looked closely as I did, you'd notice the cracks. Earlier that afternoon, I'd gone into my father's study to place an old photo album on the shelf. The door had been locked, which wasn't unusual, but this time when I knocked, no one answered. Through the narrow crack near the hinges, I'd heard muffled voices. My father's and someone else's. Male. Older. Their words were indistinct, but the tone was clipped and businesslike. When I returned an hour later, the door was unlocked, the office looking untouched. Almost too untouched. That was clue number 1. Clue number 2 appeared as guests arrived. My cousin Frank, never one to avoid free food, stepped in, shook my hand and then quickly averted his gaze. He looked nervous, like he'd heard something he shouldn't have. He avoided my father altogether. Clue number 3 sat on the coffee table, a small ornate wooden box. My mother had placed it there for decoration, she'd said. But I'd seen that box before. It used to sit in my father's study, filled with old bank documents. It didn't belong in the living room. I stayed silent, blending into the edges of the room as laughter filled the air. "Come on, sweetheart, join the toast," my sister called out cheerfully. Her voice carried a hint of practiced politeness. She and I hadn't had a real conversation in years, not since the inheritance misunderstanding that tore us apart. Or so we'd thought. I smiled politely, stepping closer to the group but not too close. "I can see just fine from here," I replied softly. My father caught my eye mid-toast. His grin faltered for half a second, just enough to make my pulse quicken. He didn't know what I had found yet, but something about my gaze must have told him that tonight, I wasn't the daughter standing proudly in his shadow anymore. Guests circulated around me with plates of food and glasses of cheap champagne. Laughter bubbled up in waves. Someone turned on a soft jazz playlist. My niece ran past me, almost knocking into my leg. "Sorry, Auntie," she giggled before disappearing toward the kitchen. I took a slow breath, letting the cinnamon scent and faint hum of conversation ground me. I wasn't here to cause a scene. Not yet. I was here to observe. To listen. To confirm what I already suspected. My sister approached, holding a glass of red wine, her dress a shade too bright for the occasion. "You're awfully quiet," she said with that familiar, slightly judgmental smile. "Nervous about giving a speech?" "I'm not the one making speeches tonight," I replied. She tilted her head. "You know, Dad told me you've been asking a lot of questions lately. About money. About the house." I told him not to worry. "You always overthink things." My heart gave a small, cold twist. He thought she was being clever, protective even. She didn't realize she was confirming what I needed to know. "Right?" I said, forcing a faint smile. "You know me. Always overthinking." As she walked away, I noticed her husband lean toward her, whispering something. Her eyes flicked briefly in my direction. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was unease. The jazz shifted to a slower tune. My mother began circulating with a tray of appetizers, playing the gracious hostess. "Try the spinach puffs, honey," she urged me as she passed. Her eyes were bright, too bright. She was performing as she always did when something was being hidden. I watched my father pull aside the older man I'd overheard earlier. They stepped onto the back porch, voices low. I couldn't hear everything, but one phrase floated through the air as the door briefly opened to let a guest out. Before she finds out. My stomach tightened, but my face remained calm. I sipped my drink slowly. Inside my purse, the folder pressed against my side like a heartbeat. Inside it were photocopies of bank transfers, property records, and one particularly damning letter that had been tucked into the back of an old ledger. A ledger my father probably assumed I'd never find. He was wrong. By 7:15 the room was crowded. Every chair was taken, people spilled into the hallway. The air felt warm and thick with too many bodies. Someone opened a window, letting in the cool evening breeze. Outside, string lights flickered softly against the darkening sky. My cousin leaned over near the punch bowl. "You okay?" he asked in a low voice. I met his eyes. Why wouldn't I be? He hesitated. No reason. Just stay sharp tonight. That was clue number 4. I moved toward the hallway where the shadows deepened. From here I could see the entire living room without being fully seen. My father returned inside, his voice booming again. "Let's take a moment to appreciate what truly matters," he said, raising his glass once more. "Family, loyalty, and the legacy we leave behind." Loyalty. The word hit like a knife. Everyone lifted their glasses. My mother pressed a hand to her chest, dabbing her eyes dramatically. My sister beamed. Guests clapped. I didn't move. I watched. I memorized every expression, every word, every slip. As the toast ended, people broke into smaller conversations. I slipped into the kitchen, pretending to refill my glass. From the doorway I caught my father slipping back into his study. The door closed quietly behind him. This time I followed. I didn't enter the room, but I positioned myself in the narrow hallway where I could hear faintly through the door. Papers shuffled. A drawer clicked shut. His voice was low, measured. "She's here. No, she doesn't know. Just keep it quiet until next month." He hung up. The drawer clicked again. I stepped back into the kitchen before he emerged, my face neutral. He walked past me moments later, his expression as polished as before. I checked the clock on the wall. 8:03 p.m. The night was far from over. As the crowd gathered for cake, my father caught my gaze again. This time I didn't look away. Our eyes locked, his slightly wary, mine steady and unblinking. For the first time, the man who always controlled every conversation couldn't quite read me. I raised my glass slightly, a mock toast from the shadows. He frowned. He didn't know that the folder in my purse was already more powerful than any speech he could give tonight. And he had no idea that this anniversary celebration would be the night everything began to unravel. Our eyes locked, my glass hovering midair, his frown lingering just long enough to confirm what my gut already knew. Something was buried under all those carefully rehearsed toasts and smiles. I lowered the glass slowly, letting the murmur of the crowd swallow the silent challenge between us. That night, after the last guest had gone home and the string lights outside had gone dim, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My husband used to joke that I could smell secrets. He wasn't wrong. My father's look had told me everything. He was hiding something. And whatever it wasn't small. I couldn't sleep. Around 2:17 a.m. I finally slipped out of bed, wrapped my robe tight and padded softly down the hallway. The house was still except for the ticking of the wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator. My parents' study door was closed as always. But I knew something he didn't. Over the years I had memorized the rhythm of that lock. A slight push upward on the knob before turning left. It clicked open with barely a sound. The smell hit me first. Old paper, furniture polish, and the faint metallic tang of coins. It was the same smell the room had when I was a little girl sneaking in to use his typewriter. The moonlight spilled through the blinds in narrow silver stripes, landing on the shelves like stage lights. I started with the obvious. Drawers. He had always kept them obsessively neat. Tonight they were too neat. Like someone had recently gone through them and put things back just so. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old tax returns, I found the first clue. A single folded bank statement from a closed account. The numbers on the page made my heart give a sharp, cold thump. Large withdrawals years ago, but steady. Why keep just one? Unless the rest was somewhere else. I moved to the bookcase. My father loved the illusion of order. alphabetized titles, evenly spaced spines. But there was one shelf that had always bothered me. A row of dusty encyclopedias that no one had touched since the early 90s. I pulled the fourth volume forward. A soft thud came from behind it. My pulse quickened. One by one I removed the books. Behind them was a narrow wooden panel. It looked like part of the wall, but when I pressed gently it shifted. A small latch gave way, revealing a shallow compartment no bigger than a bread box. Inside sat a faded cardboard box, edges frayed, lid slightly warped. My hands trembled, not from fear but from the strange electric thrill of finally catching something real. I placed the box on the desk and lifted the lid. A puff of dust escaped, dancing in the moonlight like ghosts. Inside were stacks of papers, envelopes, and a small leather-bound ledger. Its cover was cracked, corners worn. My father's handwriting ran across the front in neat, black ink. Household accounts. But this wasn't about grocery lists. The first few pages looked innocent enough. Expenses from decades ago, handwritten columns, careful tallies. Then somewhere around page 30 the handwriting changed. The entries became coded. Initials, dates, vague descriptions. But the numbers told their own story. Large sums appeared regularly, far beyond anything a family on my father's modest salary should have had. I flipped further and found something worse. Property addresses I didn't recognize. Some had little check marks beside them. Others had dates, purchase, sale. The amounts matched none of the family conversations I could recall. My throat went dry. A faint creak outside the study made me freeze. I closed the ledger quickly, holding my breath. Footsteps passed the door, slow, slippered. My mother, probably heading to the kitchen for water. I waited, unmoving, until they faded. I resumed digging through the box. At the very bottom, beneath layers of receipts, I found a yellowed envelope labeled in my father's precise block letters, legal, private. Inside were copies of legal filings, a bank certificate, and one letter that made my stomach twist. It was from a financial institution addressed to both my parents, confirming the successful redirection of inheritance funds to a joint investment account. The date? 2 months after my grandfather died. I remembered that time vividly. My sister and I were told there was nothing left for us after medical bills. We accepted it. We trusted them. My fingers shook as I held the letter. That was the moment the betrayal stopped being a suspicion and became a fact. I didn't cry, not then. I felt something colder settle into my chest. A clarity I hadn't felt in years. I took out my phone, careful not to use the flash, and began photographing everything. The ledger, the letters, the statements. Each click of the camera sounded deafening in the silent room. I slipped the envelope and ledger back exactly as I'd found them, lowered the box into its compartment, and replaced every encyclopedia in perfect order. Before locking the study door behind me, I paused and looked at the room one last time. I had spent so many years thinking of it as my father's fortress. Tonight I realized it was a vault built on deception. The next morning, over coffee, my mother chatted about the party as if nothing were amiss. I watched her carefully. She was good at this, pretending everything was fine. She'd had decades of practice. Everyone loved the food, she said, buttering her toast. It was such a lovely night. I replied, pretending to read the paper. She gave me a side glance. You disappeared for a bit last night. Everything okay? Fine, I said evenly. I just needed some air. She nodded but didn't fully buy it. Mothers never do. Over the next few days I began piecing the puzzle together. The photographs revealed a timeline. Money diverted over years, properties bought quietly, funds transferred under initials that matched relatives, family, friends, even shell names. It wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a strategy. I visited the county records office under the pretense of needing documents for my taxes. With a bit of patience and a friendly smile, I pulled property histories tied to those addresses. Every one of them linked back to my parents in some way. Each discovery was like lifting another layer of dust, revealing the rot beneath. Emotionally, it hit me in waves. One moment, anger burned hot in my chest. The next, disbelief made me sit down mid-task. But above all, a quiet resolve grew stronger each day. They had spent years scripting this story, turning my sister and me against each other, while they built their safety net on lies. I thought about confronting them right away. The idea flashed through my mind like a match. Bright, tempting, reckless. But then I pictured my father's face at the party, the way he'd frowned when I met his eyes. He wasn't just hiding something. He was guarding it. If I charged in blindly, he'd shut everything down. But this needed patience. Precision. One afternoon, while my parents were out shopping, I returned to the study, not to steal anything but to make sure I'd missed nothing. This time I checked beneath the desk drawers. There, taped underneath, was a small metal key. It fit a lock on the bottom cabinet of the bookcase. Inside, I found a fireproof envelope containing insurance documents, a few bearer bonds, and a handwritten note in my father's unmistakable block letters. In case of emergency, do not disclose. The bonds were substantial. Not millions, but enough to prove this wasn't just a misunderstanding. I placed everything back exactly. My hands were steady now. This wasn't shock anymore. It was strategy forming. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling again. But unlike before, I didn't feel restless. I felt focused. I had evidence. Real evidence. And for the first time I knew they had no idea I was coming. That certainty didn't bring me peace. It brought me purpose. Lying there in the dark, the faint hum of the ceiling fan above me, I felt the calm clarity I used to feel before making difficult decisions in my younger years. It wasn't rage that guided me now. It was precision. The very next morning I made coffee like any other day. I buttered my toast, watered the small basil plant on the windowsill, and watched the neighborhood wake up. But behind that stillness my mind worked quickly. Evidence was nothing without strategy. The first step was finding someone I could trust. Someone who understood the legal and financial world better than I did. I wasn't going to march into my parents' living room and wave papers in their faces. Well, that would have given them time to hide, to maneuver. I needed to move quietly, like water seeping through cracks. I reached for the small address book I kept in the drawer beside the phone. Most of the names were old friends, church contacts, or neighbors. But tucked between the pages was a card I'd kept for years. Alan Jacobs, estate attorney. Alan had been a friend of mine since our children were in school together. She'd gone on to build a small but sharp legal practice handling family estates and financial disputes. More importantly, she'd lived through her own family betrayal. I knew she'd understand. I called her that afternoon. "Alan, it's me," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Of course it's you," she laughed. "What's going on?" "It's been ages." "I need your help," I said simply. There was a pause on the line, the kind between two women who know when something serious is being said. "When can you come in?" she asked. We met the next morning at her office, a converted Victorian house that smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper. She greeted me with a warm hug but quickly sensed the weight I carried. In her small wood-paneled conference room, I laid out everything. The photographs, the copies of the ledger, the inheritance letter. Her brow furrowed deeper with each page she flipped. "Good Lord," she whispered at one point, tapping the letter from the financial institution. "They redirected the funds legally but without disclosure. This isn't just morally wrong, it's actionable." I leaned back in my chair. "I don't want to drag them through court. Not yet. I want control. Quiet control. They've had years to write this script. I want to rewrite it without them realizing." She looked at me thoughtfully, the way lawyers do when they're mentally drafting 3 steps ahead. "There are ways," she said slowly. "Account freezes, injunctions, strategic filings. It has to be timed precisely." "Tell me everything," I replied. For the next hour she walked me through possibilities. My parents' investments and properties could be quietly tied up through a combination of legal notices and strategic challenges. If timed right, they wouldn't be able to move assets or sell property without going through formal proceedings. Proceedings I would control. I listened carefully, taking notes like a student. I wasn't a lawyer, but I'd lived long enough to know how people behave when their power is threatened. The key was subtlety. If they felt cornered too soon, they'd bury things I hadn't found yet. The following week was a blur of deliberate, quiet action. I signed documents, authorized filings, and gave Ellen the green light to move forward. She was meticulous, choosing the order of each step like a chess player setting traps. The first tremor hit my parents on a Tuesday morning. My father went to make a routine transfer from one of their investment accounts. The bank flagged it. Unusual activity. He called them. They informed him a legal freeze had been placed pending a review. That evening at their house I watched him pace the living room. He didn't know I knew. "It's probably just a mistake," my mother said, wringing her hands. Call them again tomorrow. I did, he snapped. They said there are filings they have to review. Who would file something like that? I sipped my tea quietly at the corner of the table, heart steady. By Thursday, a second notice arrived for a different property. An injunction preventing sale or transfer until a title discrepancy was reviewed. He spent hours in his study making phone calls, his voice rising with frustration. I continued visiting as usual. Helping my mother with errands. Bringing over a casserole. I acted like the daughter they'd always known, present but harmless. But underneath, every visit gave me the chance to observe the growing cracks. My mother's face was the first to betray panic. She started making more phone calls of her own. Whispered ones. Late at night. I'd catch her in the hallway if I stopped by unannounced, clutching the phone to her chest like a lifeline. My sister, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware. Or so I thought. One afternoon she called me unexpectedly. Hey, she said, her voice cautious. Have Mom or Dad mentioned anything weird about the accounts? My pulse jumped. Why? I don't know. Dad sounded off when I talked to him yesterday. Like he's hiding something. Kept my tone light. You know, Dad. He probably misplaced a statement. She laughed a little, but it wasn't genuine. Yeah. Maybe. After we hung up, I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. That call had confirmed something important. The freeze was starting to ripple through the family quietly. They were confused. Unsteady. But they didn't suspect me. Not yet. A small subplot emerged at church that weekend. My parents had always prided themselves on their public image. Pillars of the community, generous donors. But during coffee hour after the service, I overheard two of their friends whispering near the pastries. Did you hear about the Smithsons? One woman murmured. Something's happening with their accounts. I heard a property deal fell through. I pretended to pour sugar into my coffee, my back turned. When I arrived at my parents' house the following Tuesday, my father's usually calm face had hardened into a mask of quiet fury. The bank says someone filed challenges on 3 of our accounts, he said abruptly. I set my purse down slowly. That sounds serious. It is, he snapped. Then he caught himself. We'll sort it out. I gave a small nod, watching him carefully. This was the man who used to control every conversation, every outcome. But now, subtle panic flickered beneath the surface. Day by day the legal web tightened. Ellen was brilliant. She timed each filing so that just as they were scrambling to address one issue, another appeared. By the end of the month they were juggling 5 separate freezes, each in a different stage of legal review. The best part? They couldn't trace any of it back to me. All filings were done through proper legal channels, citing technical discrepancies and procedural reviews. It looked like a bureaucratic storm, not a personal attack. And through it all I remained their calm, dutiful daughter. I listened when my mother complained. I offered gentle suggestions when my father muttered about hiring a new accountant. I even brought over coffee one morning, just to check on them. Internally I tracked every reaction, every crack in their confidence. One evening after dinner I stayed late to help my mother wash dishes. She dried each plate absent-mindedly, her mind clearly elsewhere. Finally she spoke in a low voice. Something's happening, she said. I can feel it. I glanced at her, keeping my voice soft. Like what? She hesitated. Like someone's pulling strings behind the scenes. I looked down at the dish towel in my hands, folding it neatly. Maybe it's just life catching up, I said lightly. But inside I knew exactly what was happening. By the end of that 3rd week, Ellen called me. It's done, she said. Every major vein of their financial power is effectively frozen. They can't sell, transfer, or move without coming through legal channels we control. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, staring out the window at the fading sunset. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was a deep, quiet satisfaction. For years they had moved in silence, shifting money, hiding truth. Now their silence was their trap. And I was the one tightening it. That thought stayed with me like a quiet drumbeat as the days crept closer to their anniversary celebration. Not the small family gathering from weeks ago, but the real event. An annual affair they hosted every year for neighbors, relatives, and church friends. It was their way of polishing their image, of showing everyone how well they were doing. This year, though, I saw it differently. This was no longer their stage. It was mine. I spent the days leading up to the party moving like a woman with 2 faces. On the surface, I was the helpful daughter, calling caterers, helping hang lights in the backyard, offering to set up tables. My mother, relieved to have my cooperation, welcomed me back into her inner circle without a second thought. She didn't realize I wasn't joining her world. I was rearranging it. Behind closed doors, Alan and I finalized every piece of paperwork. Transfers, deeds, notices. Each document had already been processed quietly over the last few weeks. All that remained was to reveal what they had built, and what I had dismantled. The night of the party arrived crisp and cool, the kind of evening where sound travels easily through the air. I arrived early, wearing a black suit with a simple pearl necklace. I hadn't dressed this sharply in years. As I stood in front of the mirror before leaving home, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, but because for once I wasn't walking into one of their events as a daughter seeking approval. I was walking in as someone who had already changed the game. The house buzzed with activity when I arrived. String lights hung overhead like soft constellations. The caterers hustled between the kitchen and backyard. A jazz trio set up in the corner of the patio, testing their instruments. My mother floated around in a pastel dress, greeting early guests. My father, wearing his favorite gray blazer, laughed a little too loudly at someone's joke. I walked through the house slowly, absorbing every detail. The scent of roasted chicken mingled with freshly cut flowers. Glasses clinked. People hugged. On the surface, it was their usual elegant facade. But I could see it now. The faint tightness in my father's jaw, the way my mother kept checking her phone between conversations. Their world looked the same, but it wasn't. "Glad you could make it early," my mother said, bustling toward me with a clipboard in hand. "I need you to keep an eye on the dessert table later. We had a mix-up with the delivery." "Of course," I said with a soft smile. She mistook my calm for compliance. Guests began arriving in steady waves. Neighbors from 3 doors down, old church friends, a few distant cousins. I moved through the crowd quietly, like someone studying a familiar room under a new kind of light. Frank, my cousin, caught my eye and gave me a brief nod. He didn't know the details, but he had sensed the shift weeks ago. Half an hour into the party, I slipped into the small hallway that led to my father's study. Not to snoop. Everything I needed had already been found. But I needed to steady myself. I leaned against the cool wall, closed my eyes and took a slow breath. I wasn't nervous about what I was about to do. I was steadying the flood of emotions that came with it. Decades of manipulation, favoritism, whispered half-truths. They were all about to surface in a single night. "Everything all right?" I opened my eyes. It was my sister. She stood in the doorway holding a glass of wine, her expression curious but cautious. "Fine," I replied. "Just needed a second." She studied me for a moment. "You've been different lately," she said softly. "Calmer. Like you know something the rest of us don't." I let a small smile slip. "Maybe I do." Her brow furrowed. She opened her mouth to ask more, but my father's booming voice called her name from across the house. She gave me one last searching look and walked away. I checked my watch. 7:59 p.m. At exactly 8 o'clock, the jazz trio switched to a slower, more formal tune. My father stepped up to the small podium they'd placed near the patio doors. Every year he gave the same speech, about hard work, family, and the legacy we build. I'd heard it so many times I could recite it backwards. This year I let him talk. Let him paint his perfect picture. The guests clapped politely at each pause. My mother dabbed at her eyes on cue. My sister smiled dutifully. As he raised his glass for the closing toast, I stepped forward. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor, cutting through the soft music. Heads turned. A few guests smiled at me, assuming I was going to say something sweet. My father's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. He hadn't expected me to speak. "Before we toast," I said, my voice clear but calm, "I'd like to say a few words." My father froze, glass still raised. My mother's smile faltered. The guests quieted. I stepped up to the podium and set my small black folder on its surface. My hands didn't shake. I looked out at the crowd, people who had known our family for decades. People who believed the story my parents had crafted. "My parents have built a beautiful life here," I began. "And for that I respect the work they've done. But tonight isn't just about what's visible. Sometimes the things we build quietly are far more powerful than the things we display." There was a soft rustle among the guests. My father's hand twitched at his side. I opened the folder and held up a single sheet of paper, not the damning evidence itself, but a notice of legal transfer already completed. I didn't explain it fully. I let its presence speak first. For years I thought I knew the full story of our family, I continued. I was wrong. There were things hidden, deeply, carefully, deliberately. But what's done in silence can also be undone in silence. From the corner of my eye, I saw my father take a step forward, then stop himself. He understood the weight of my words even if the guests didn't yet. Behind me a portable screen flickered to life. Ellen, efficient as always, had helped me prepare a slideshow of documents. Not overly detailed but enough to suggest something significant had shifted. Property notices. Account updates. Dates. Signatures. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Whispered questions spread like wind through dry leaves. My mother's face drained of color. She clutched her pearl necklace with trembling fingers. My sister stared at the screen, her wine glass frozen midair. This family, I said, my voice steady, has been built on more than words. And tonight you'll see some of that for yourselves. I didn't name the betrayal. Not yet. I didn't explain the full extent. That was for later. But the images alone, legal headers, sealed notices, clear signatures, were enough to fracture the illusion my parents had maintained for decades. My father finally spoke, his voice tight. That's enough. No, I said calmly, turning to face him fully. It isn't. The guests watched spellbound. Some with curiosity. Some with quiet dread. I clicked to the final slide, an official document with their names on it. A transfer. Their wealth frozen and redirected, legally and quietly. I didn't say what it meant. I didn't have to. The silence in the backyard said it all. I closed the folder slowly and stepped away from the podium. The jazz trio remained frozen mid-note. My father stood stiff, my mother trembling beside him. The image on the screen glowed behind them like an unspoken confession. I walked through the crowd without looking back. My heels echoed against the floor. People parted as I passed, their eyes following me. For years they'd built this stage to glorify themselves. Tonight I had turned it into a mirror. And for the first time they had to see their reflection. I stepped through the parted crowd, the last notes of the jazz trio hanging awkwardly in the air. Behind me the glowing screen showed their signatures, their dates, their betrayals. No commentary needed. Just truth hanging in the backyard like thick, unmoving fog. I didn't rush to the door. I moved slowly, deliberately, weaving between stunned neighbors and wide-eyed relatives. Every step carried the weight of decades. The whispered lies, the favoritism, the way they turned my sister and me into pawns without ever raising their voices. As I reached the side gate, a voice called sharply behind me. Stop. It was my father. I turned. The crowd had parted even more, forming a rough circle around him and my mother. He wasn't the booming, confident man from his speeches anymore. His blazer hung unevenly, his hair slightly mussed. My mother's hand clung to his arm like a woman steadying herself in a storm. His voice came lower this time, controlled but tight. What have you done? The question wasn't about the slideshow. It was about everything. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, the way he used to when I was a child in trouble, waiting until my guilt filled the air. This time it was his turn to drown in it. I did, I finally said, what you both thought I'd never do. I paid attention. A soft murmur ran through the guests. He took a step toward me. You've embarrassed this family. I tilted my head. No, you embarrassed yourselves. I just turned on the lights. My mother's voice cracked. You don't understand what you've done. You think this makes you look strong? You've destroyed everything. The words didn't sting. They used to. But not anymore. I had lived too long in their carefully managed shadows. No, I said softly. I've freed myself from everything you built on lies. My sister stepped forward then, pale and visibly shaken. Her eyes darted between our parents and me. Is this true? She asked, her voice trembling. All of it. My father hesitated just for a moment, but it was enough. My sister saw it. Her face crumpled. You told me she was greedy, she whispered to them. You said she wanted everything for herself. Her voice broke. I watched years of resentment and misunderstanding wash over her like a tide finally pulling back. She wasn't my enemy. She never had been. They took the money after Grandpa died, I said calmly, not for drama but for truth. They redirected it, hid it, invested it. $400,000. While you and I fought over scraps, they built their safety net. The collective gasp from the guests wasn't loud. It was sharp and thin, like the snap of a rope finally breaking. My father's jaw clenched. You don't know everything. You're right, I said. But I know enough. I know about the hidden ledger behind the bookshelf. I know about the investment accounts, the properties, the insurance envelope under your desk. I know how every dollar moved while you pretended there was nothing left. He stared at me then, not as a daughter but as someone who had outmaneuvered him. And here's the part you don't know, I continued, lowering my voice. While you were scrambling to figure out why your accounts kept freezing, I was working with Ellen Jacobs. Every asset you buried has already been legally transferred, frozen, or locked under review. You can't touch it without me now. His face went rigid. My mother let out a sharp inhale like she'd been slapped. You did this, he said, incredulous. Yes, I replied. Quietly. Just like you did. That was the twist, the one they hadn't seen coming. They thought they were the only ones capable of moving in silence. They taught me their methods, not knowing I'd use them against them. My sister turned to me, tears in her eyes. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed proof first, I said. And because I wanted you to hear it from them, not me. For once, they don't get to rewrite the story. The backyard had fallen into near silence now, broken only by the faint buzz of the string lights overhead. People exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifted their weight, clearly uncomfortable to witness a family's unraveling. But I didn't care about their discomfort. This wasn't their story. It was mine. My father's voice lowered into that cold tone he'd used my entire life, the one that usually made me shrink. You'll regret this. I met his gaze evenly. No. You will. I turned away, heading toward the house, but my sister caught my arm. Wait, she whispered. What happens now? It was a fair question. For years, she and I had been on opposite sides of a wall neither of us built. Now that wall was gone. We talk, I said softly. Honestly. Without them in the middle. She nodded slowly, still trembling. Something shifted between us then. Not reconciliation, not yet. But the beginning of it. Inside the house, I found a quiet corner by the fireplace. I leaned against the mantel, feeling the weight of the night settle into my bones. I wasn't euphoric. Revenge isn't always fireworks. Sometimes it's the slow, steady realization that you've taken back the narrative of your own life. A few minutes later, my parents came in. The guests were still outside, buzzing with whispers. My father closed the door behind him, his movements slower than usual. My mother stood beside him, shoulders stiff. He spoke first. Do you have any idea what this means? Legally? Yes, I said. More than you think. His eyes narrowed. You're going to ruin us. I shook my head. No. I'm going to make sure you live with what you did. Every transfer, every property, every dollar is documented. If you want to fight me, we'll do it publicly. But something tells me you don't want that. It was the first time I saw genuine fear flash across his face. Not of me, but of losing the control he had spent his life maintaining. My mother tried to appeal to me then. Her voice softened, almost trembling. We did what we thought was best. For the family. For you girls. I let out a small laugh, not cruel, just tired. No. You did what was best for yourselves. And you did it quietly, thinking no one would ever find out. She flinched. I straightened, feeling a calm strength settle over me. You took in silence, I said. I ended it the same way. For a long time none of us spoke. The sounds of the party carried faintly through the windows. The music, the chatter, the shifting of feet as guests prepared to leave. It felt like the house itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Eventually my father said, So what now? Now, I replied, you live with the consequences. And I live free of your lies. I walked past them out to the porch. The night air was cool against my skin. My sister joined me a moment later, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Do you feel different? She asked quietly. Yes, I said. Not lighter. Just clear. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I wish we'd known sooner. Me too, I said. But maybe this is the only way it could have happened. Out in the backyard, guests were slowly dispersing, their faces etched with the memory of what they'd witnessed. No one would ever look at my parents the same way again. I didn't need applause. I didn't need forgiveness. I just needed the truth to stand where their lies had once been. As I stepped off the porch, the gravel crunched beneath my heels. The air smelled faintly of smoke from the outdoor fire pit. I paused, taking it all in. For decades, their silence had shaped my life. Tonight, my silence had ended theirs. And that was enough. If this story gripped your heart, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe for more dark, emotional revenge stories. Because sometimes, the quietest people deliver the loudest payback.